The wind out here had a sound, a long, mournful moan that never stopped. It swept over the hills, through the sagebrush, and into the wooden cracks of the coach, whispering warnings that no one could understand. It carried the dust of cattle trails, the scent of earth and smoke, and something else, a loneliness so deep it felt alive. Evelyn clutched her small, gloved hands in her lap. At 18, she was a bride. A woman by law, but in her heart she still felt like a frightened girl from the East. Her gray traveling dress was neat but already covered in trail dust. Her bonnet hid her pale, delicate face, but nothing could hide the fear in her eyes. She had left behind the green woods and narrow cobblestone streets of Virginia to marry a man she had never met, a man whose name alone sounded carved from stone, Jebediah Claymore. Her father had called it a fine match. He had spoken with forced cheer when he handed her the letter from the matchmaker. He's a rancher of good means, Evelyn. A man who can take care of you. Behind his words, she had heard the exhaustion of a man with too many mouths to feed and too few coins left to do it. She had wanted to argue, but what could she say? A woman without a husband in her world had no future. So she packed her life into one small trunk and boarded the westbound stage. Now, as the coach jolted over the last ridge, the driver, a grizzled man named Silas, spat his tobacco and grunted, "Cedar Creek." The words were almost stolen by the wind. Evelyn leaned out the window. What she saw made her breath catch. The town was barely more than a scar on the land. One dusty main street lined with a handful of raw wooden buildings, a saloon with swinging doors that groaned in the wind, a blacksmith's forge puffing thin smoke, a general store, a church, and not much else. No trees, no flowers, just an ocean of brown earth stretching to the horizon. Her heart sank. This was to be her new home. As the coach rolled to a stop, heads turned. Men in sweat-stained hats paused their work. Women in faded dresses stopped sweeping porches. Their eyes followed her every move, curious, judging, whispering. Evelyn felt her face flush under their gaze. She was the mail-order bride. The stranger come to marry the silent man of Stone Creek Ranch. Silas opened the door and tipped his hat. "Best get on out, miss." "He'll be waitin'," Evelyn hesitated, then stepped down into the dust. The wind tugged at her skirts. She stood small and fragile in a world that seemed made for stronger souls. Then she saw him. He stood apart from the others. Tall, broad-shouldered, his stance as solid as the land beneath him. His hat shadowed his face, but even from a distance, she recognized the sharp angles of his jaw, the dark, steady eyes from the photograph she had studied so many times. Jebediah Claymore. He looked older than his 35 years, not by weakness, but by the hard weight of solitude. He didn't walk toward her. He waited. Like a man who did not move for anyone. Evelyn gathered her courage and stepped forward, her heart pounding so loud she feared he might hear it. "Mr. Claymore," she said softly when she reached him. He tipped his hat, his voice low and rough as gravel. "Miss Grace." Journey was satisfactory. It was not a greeting. It was a formality. A business question, spoken without warmth. It was long. She answered quietly. He nodded once. "This land is long," he said, his eyes sweeping over her in a single, assessing glance. There was no welcome there, only calculation, the way a rancher might look over a new horse before buying it. The thought stung, and she felt shame and anger rise in her chest. "My things," she began, turning toward the stagecoach Silas will bring them. He said curtly, already walking toward a wagon. He moved with easy confidence, his boots crunching on the dirt, his long stride unhurried, the kind of man who never looked back. Evelyn followed him in silence, her small steps hurrying to match his long ones. He loaded her trunk onto the buckboard with effortless strength and offered his hand for her to climb up beside him. She hesitated only a moment before placing her gloved fingers in his. His hand was calloused, rough from work, and the brief touch sent a shiver through her. She wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. the ride to the ranch was silent. The wagon jolted and swayed over the rough trail, the horses' hooves thudding in rhythm with her racing heart. She tried to speak, to ask about the land, the cattle, anything, but the words died in her throat. The man beside her was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The plains stretched endlessly around them, dotted with herds of longhorn cattle bearing a brand shaped like a twisted "See Claymore's mark." This was his kingdom, wild, vast, and utterly alone. As they topped a ridge, she saw the ranch below. A great dark house stood at the center, 2 stories tall and built of heavy timber and stone. Barns and corrals surrounded it, all built with the same harsh practicality. Stone Creek Ranch. The name suited it, hard and unforgiving. When the wagon stopped in the yard, Jebediah climbed down first. "We'll be married in the morning," he said simply. "Justice of the peace rides out from town. You can rest tonight, married in the morning." The words hit her like a blow. No courtship, no gentle welcome, just a plan spoken as fact. She nodded, her throat too tight to answer. He led her inside the house. The great stone hearth dominated the main room, where a small fire burned. The air smelled of leather and smoke. Everything was clean but bare. No flowers, no curtains, no warmth. A house made by a man who didn't expect company. "Your room is upstairs," he said, pointing first on the right, "supper at sundown." Then he turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the echoing silence. Evelyn stood in the center of the room, listening to the faint ticking of a clock. She felt small, like a ghost haunting someone else's life. She wanted to run, to chase the coach back east, but there was nothing left for her there. This was her world now. She climbed the stairs, each creak loud in the quiet. The room he had given her was plain. A bed, a washstand, a window looking out over the vast plains. The sky was already darkening to gray. Her trunk arrived moments later, carried easily in his strong hands. He set it down, paused in the doorway, and for the first time, their eyes met. There was no softness there, only something deep and hidden. Pain, maybe, or loneliness. Then he turned and walked away. When the door closed, she sank onto the edge of the bed. The silence pressed in around her. The wind howled against the windows, and tears she had been holding for days began to spill down her cheeks. She was a wife in name, yet alone in every other way. She had come seeking safety, but found only emptiness and the cold comfort of duty. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Jebediah Claymore, and tonight, for the first time in her young life, she truly understood what it meant to be completely, utterly alone. The next morning came cold and still, the Wyoming sky a pale wash of silver. The house smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke. Evelyn dressed in silence, her hands trembling as she buttoned the simple cream-colored gown she had sewn herself. She stared at her reflection in the small mirror, her pale face framed by soft brown hair, her eyes wide and uncertain. Today she would become Mrs. Jebediah Claymore. The ceremony was as stark as the land around them. No music, no guests, no flowers. Just the justice of the peace, a tired man named Miller, standing before the stone hearth with a small Bible in his hand. Eli, Jebediah's quiet foreman, and his kind-faced wife Martha stood as witnesses. Martha had offered Evelyn a warm smile as she helped fasten the final button on her gown earlier that morning, whispering, "You'll be all right, dear." It was the only kindness Evelyn had felt since arriving. When the justice began to speak, the words seemed to come from far away. Evelyn's voice quivered as she repeated her vows, the syllables catching in her throat. Jebediah's voice was steady, deep, unyielding. He spoke like a man reciting an agreement, not pledging his heart. When the justice pronounced them man and wife, there was no kiss, only a brief handshake, his large rough palm enclosing hers, sealing their union with the cold weight of duty. Afterward, the witnesses offered quiet congratulations, then took their leave. By late afternoon, the ranch was silent again. Only the ticking of the clock and the restless cry of the wind filled the empty house. Supper was waiting on the stove, left by Martha. Beef stew and fresh bread. Evelyn sat opposite Jebediah at the long wooden table. The firelight flickered between them, throwing long shadows on the walls. He ate slowly, mechanically, his eyes fixed on his bowl. Evelyn could barely touch her food. The stew smelled rich, but every bite turned to dust in her mouth. The silence between them was a canyon, wide, echoing, impossible to cross. When he finished, Jebediah rose, carrying his empty bowl to the sink. He did not take hers. It was a small thing, but it told her everything. He was not unkind, but neither was he gentle. He existed in a world of hard necessity, and she was merely another responsibility in it. He turned toward her. "It's late," he said, his tone even and unreadable. Her heart began to race. She stood, her chair scraping against the floor, the sound startlingly loud in the still room. He took the lantern and led her up the stairs. Each step creaked beneath his heavy boots, echoing like drumbeats in her chest. She followed, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of her skirt. He did not take her to the guest room she had slept in the night before. He stopped at the last door down the hall, his room. He opened it and stepped aside for her to enter. The room was large but bare. A massive bed stood at its center, sheets stark white against the dark wood. A rifle rested in the corner. The air smelled faintly of soap, leather, and the clean chill of the outdoors. "I'll give you a moment," he said, his voice low. Without waiting for a reply, he turned and closed the door behind him. His footsteps faded down the hall. Evelyn stood frozen. The silence pressed in on her. The bed loomed before her like an altar, and she its trembling offering. Her heart pounded so hard she felt sick. She walked to her trunk and lifted the lid with shaking hands. Inside lay the nightgown her mother had packed for her, a delicate piece of white cotton and lace, folded neatly among lavender sachets. It had once made her feel pretty. Now it felt like mockery. She undressed slowly, her fingers fumbling with each button. When the dress finally fell away, she shivered in the cold air. The nightgown felt thin, fragile, no shield at all against what was coming. She caught her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. A pale, wide-eyed girl staring back. "You are his wife," she whispered to herself, trying to steady her breathing. "You must be brave." A soft knock broke the silence, and the door opened. Jebediah entered, the lantern in his hand casting warm light over the room. He had removed his gun belt and his outer shirt, wearing only a plain undershirt and dark trousers. His presence filled the space, solid, commanding, unbearably close. He set the lantern on the bedside table, its flame flickering between them. His gaze found hers. There was no cruelty in his eyes, but no tenderness either. Just the same unreadable calm. He took a step forward, and the floorboards creaked beneath his weight. Evelyn's breath caught. Her knees felt weak. He stopped beside the bed, looking down at her. "You're afraid," he said quietly. The words broke something inside her. She couldn't answer. The tears came before she could stop them, silent at first, then shaking her whole body. She pressed her hands to her face, ashamed, but the sobs came anyway, raw, helpless, unstoppable. At 18, she cried on her wedding night. Jebediah froze. The moment stretched like glass between them. He had expected obedience, perhaps fear, but not this. Not a girl's broken weeping. His jaw tightened. He turned his face away, as if trying to look anywhere but at her tears. He had faced blizzards that could kill a man in minutes. He had fought in the war, buried his father and brother with his own hands. He understood pain, loss, even death. But this quiet, shuddering sorrow was something he didn't know how to fight. It cut through his armor in a way no bullet ever had. He took a long breath, his shoulders rising and falling. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing something soft and pained in his eyes. Slowly, he stepped back from the bed. He ran a hand over his face, as if trying to wipe away some invisible burden. "There's no need for that," he said hoarsely. He turned, walked to the armchair by the fireplace, and sank into it heavily. The chair creaked under his weight. He stared into the cold hearth, his hands clasped together, saying nothing. The silence stretched, but it was different now, less sharp, less dangerous. Evelyn watched him through her tears, hardly believing what she saw. He had stopped. He had chosen not to take what was his by law, by the rules of this land. He had seen her fear and stepped away. For a long time, neither spoke. The lantern's flame grew smaller, shadows deepening in the corners of the room. Finally, Jebediah rose. He opened the wardrobe, pulled out a blanket and pillow, and laid them on the floor beside the bed. Without a word, he blew out the lantern, plunging the room into darkness. Evelyn lay still, listening. She heard him settle down on the floor, the faint rustle of fabric, the soft exhale of breath. Outside, the wind howled its lonely tune against the windows. Inside, two strangers lay in the same room, separated by a few feet, in a chasm of silence. Her wedding night ended not in passion, but in mercy. He had not touched her. He had given her something she hadn't expected to find in this hard land: compassion. In the darkness, her tears finally stopped. She stared into the blackness and felt the faintest flicker of something new. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was smaller, gentler, just the fragile question of what might someday grow between them. And as she closed her eyes, she whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, "He saw me." That night, she slept, safe, untouched, and for the first time since leaving home, unafraid. The dawn after her wedding night broke sharp and clear, sunlight spilling over the Wyoming plains like liquid gold. Evelyn woke to find herself still alone in the wide, cold bed. The other side of the room was empty, the blanket and pillow neatly folded. He was gone. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. His silence, his restraint, the strange mercy he had shown her, but the faint scent of him still lingered in the air, mixed with the smoke from the dying fire. It had been real, every moment. Every tear. She rose quietly and dressed, her fingers still trembling as they fastened the buttons of her dress. When she came downstairs, the fire had already been rekindled. A pot of coffee sat on the hearth, still warm. It was a simple gesture, but it stopped her in her tracks. He had thought of her. The man who had barely spoken to her had left her something to wake to, a small sign that perhaps he did not regret what had happened between them. That morning began a new pattern of days. Jebediah rose before dawn and worked until dark. Evelyn saw him only in brief passing moments, his tall figure moving through the yard, his voice giving calm, quiet orders to the ranch hands. He was distant but never unkind. He spoke to her as he might to any ranch worker, direct, practical, measured, and though his tone was cool, he never raised his voice. In the evenings, they shared meals together at the long wooden table. He would eat in silence while she busied herself with chores or mending. The crackle of the fire and the ticking of the clock were often the only sounds in the house. But every now and then, when she looked up, she would find his eyes on her, studying, thoughtful, as if trying to solve a mystery he didn't yet understand. The house itself became her world. It was large and lonely, filled with shadows that lengthened as the sun sank behind the hills. She tried to make it her own. She dusted the shelves, washed the windows, and folded fresh linens. But no matter how hard she worked, it still felt like his house, a place built for solitude, not for warmth. Cooking became her first real battle. The West didn't offer the soft comforts of her mother's kitchen. The stove smoked, the flour was coarse, and the dry air spoiled bread faster than it could rise. Her first loaf was as hard as a stone. Her first stew, thin and tasteless. But Jebediah never complained. He ate quietly, his face giving away nothing. Still, that silence felt heavier than words. It was not cruelty. It was distance. She wondered what he thought of her. Did he regret their marriage? Did he see her as a burden? She couldn't tell. But each night when he spread his blanket on the floor beside their bed, instead of lying next to her, the ache in her chest grew stronger. Days blurred into weeks. Evelyn began to rise early, before dawn, to watch him ride out. She would stand by the window as he mounted his horse and vanished across the fields. There was something in the way he moved. Steady, sure, grounded. She began to see not just the hardness in him, but the quiet strength beneath it. One morning, she decided to change something. If this was to be her life, she would not live it in fear. She kneaded her next loaf of bread with care, remembering the advice of the kind woman who had smiled at her during her wedding, the foreman's wife. Martha let it rise twice. She had said, "Give it time, and it'll come alive." When the bread came out of the oven that afternoon, it was soft, golden, perfect. That evening, when Jebediah broke the loaf and tasted it, he looked at her for the first time in days. He didn't speak, but his eyes held a quiet flicker of surprise, a wordless acknowledgement. She smiled faintly. It was small, but it was a victory. That night, she didn't cry. As the days stretched on, she began to find pieces of herself in this wild, untamed place. She learned to fetch water from the creek, to mend fences, to ride the steady old gelding named Patches who grazed in the lower pasture. The first time she tried to mount, she fell straight into the dust. Her pride stung more than her bruised hands. Jebediah, watching from the barn, walked toward her. His shadow fell long across the dirt. "What were you trying to do?" he asked, his voice low, more startled than angry. "I want to learn to ride," she said softly, brushing dust from her skirt. He studied her for a long moment, then held out his hand. "Not on that mare. You'll break your neck." The next morning, he saddled Patches for her and showed her how to hold the reins, how to sit tall in the saddle, how to find balance in the rhythm of the horse. His instructions were curt, his tone firm, but there was no cruelty in it. Only care. Eyes up, heels down. Don't fight the horse. Feel him, he said. She followed his every word. The mare moved slowly, patiently, and for the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Evelyn felt something other than fear. She felt freedom. The wind tugged at her hair, the sun warmed her face, and the world spread out before her. Vast, wild, beautiful. When she looked over, Jebediah was watching her. One corner of his mouth curved slightly upward. It wasn't a smile exactly, but it was something close. Something real. From that day on, she practiced riding each afternoon. Sometimes she saw him watching her from the corral, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Sometimes, when she caught his gaze, he didn't look away. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Evelyn gathered her courage. "Would you teach me to shoot?" she asked. He paused, cleaning his rifle, and looked up. "Why? Because I don't want to be helpless," she said quietly. "There are snakes, coyotes, maybe worse." He considered her for a long moment, then nodded once tomorrow. The next day he took her behind the barn. He placed the rifle in her hands and stood close behind her, his voice calm and low. "Keep it steady. Breathe out when you squeeze the trigger." His calloused hands adjusted her grip, his presence both steadying and disarming. She could feel the warmth of him at her back, the smell of leather and smoke. She squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the air. One of the tin cans on the fence flew into the dirt. She gasped, half in shock, half in triumph. When she turned to him, her eyes bright with excitement, he looked at her with something new, something she had never seen in him before: respect. "Again," he said, his deep voice softening just enough for her to hear the pride beneath it. That night, as she lay in bed and listened to the quiet rhythm of his breathing on the floor beside her, Evelyn realized the distance between them had changed. It was still there, but it no longer felt like a wall. It was a bridge waiting to be crossed. And though she did not yet know it, the hardest land in America had already begun to change her, and the hardest man in Wyoming had already begun to love her.